Ladies and gentlemen, very nice to have you all here. Whilst we're waiting for Professor Chantal Del Sol, I suggest that as we're rushed for time, that Miklos Santo, the director for the Center of Fundamental Rights from Hungary, make the introduction. The name of the panel is there a place for classical values in the postmodern world? A very key question, and one I hope that we will start to answer on this panel. Miklos.
Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear founders, dear guests, dear panelists. I feel really deeply honored to be here among you at the opening inauguration or presentation of university with an openly conservative approach. I think it's a unique treasure in this world today at a time when our once great admiration for the Anglo-Saxon type universities is, to tell the truth, fading. Unfortunately, news has reached us that European and American campuses no longer tolerate views that are in opposition to the mainstream, that lecturers who refuse to conform to the dogma of the liberal power elites are no longer welcome in the hallowed halls of Western academia. We know this phenomenon well. Poles and Hungarians have had the misfortune of experiencing totalitarianism in higher education as well for 4 decades. We want none of it ever again. Thus, please allow me, first and foremost of all, to thank our dear Polish friends and partners at Ordo Iuris for establishing this university, which can light the way for Europe, or at the very least, Central Europe. The word conservative sounds like an obscenity to the ears of the dark horsemen of progression. But they also call God old and obsolete, and yet the future belongs to him. Dear friends, despite the coronavirus pandemic, the debate regarding the future of Europe rages on. In certain sense, we have gathered here today as well to show Europe the way in our usual modest and moderate manner. And when we discuss the future of Europe, we mean not just the future geopolitical state of a continent or a legal entity, but we also engage in a debate over worldviews, beliefs, and lifestyles. What we mean by evil and good. What are those values that we cherish, that we hope our children and grandchildren will adopt as their own? In my opinion, this debate over the future, like a coin, has 2 sides in the 21st century. One side, the one that the liberals are describing as the only acceptable way forward, claims that we can move towards the idealistic, or rather utopian, rather dystopian version of a real Europe by stepping over or setting aside the grandiose notions of the founding fathers regarding a European community based on a cooperation of sovereign states. They want to transcend the Europe of yesterday, the Europe you and I know and love, and they want to impose liberal values on all of society, on all our societies. Their buzzwords are communistic equality, nihilism, convenience, and virtue signaling from the comfort of their couches. Concepts like faith, God, family, common sense, normality, success, and authority are simply incomprehensible in the so-called postmodern political context that is their element. They have even twisted the notion of community beyond all recognition. Or, what is even worse, if they do recognize these ideas, they have become meaningless for them, so they can simply be set aside. The other side of the coin, one that in my opinion is crystal clear in setting out the way forward for Central Europe, is a struggle for Christian freedom. Those of us who follow this school of thought want a better and freer Europe and reject the deeper but less meaningful integration advanced by the other side. We believe that the future of Europe is a matter for the heart as well as the mind. We choose national independence over foreign occupation, community and family over individualism, a market economy over central planning, subsidiarity over centralization, and the protection of natural rights over wish fulfillment. However, we must be honest with ourselves as well. Perhaps we too have made a mistake, one that we should be able to learn from. Having awakened from the hibernation imposed upon our nations by the Iron Curtain, we assumed that, in a very positive sense, of course, time hasn't changed the West. In our mind's eye, we saw a Europe that recognized the value of work, the dignity of nations, where a husband had a wife had a husband. A Europe where even atheists were Christians, as our first democratically elected Prime Minister, Mr. Antal József, put it in Hungary. But by now, it has become clear that this approach was too idealistic a view. In reality, the constant search for compromise, the centrality of it to European politics, value neutrality, the constant bending over backwards to be inclusive and accepting towards anything that was outside the normal have all led to a point where Europe has become empty, and the soul of Europe has departed, or the Europe of spirit was lost. In its comfort and living the good life, the West has simply gone soft. Europe had tolerated everything to a point where its essence evaporated. It evaporated because Europe rejected and denied God. It declared the nation obsolete, and in the name of political correctness, it declared war on reason and the family. And Europe, let's be honest, has also lost its cultural core. The most obvious sign of this is that its official values have become an ideological deadwood, even as the Union itself has become a phalanstery-like technostructure of institutions run by namely neutral bureaucrats. The silver lining is that on this side of the continent, in this region, paradoxically, in no small way, thanks to all the difficulties and tragedies we faced throughout the decades-long suffering under the yoke of dictatorships, we have grown stronger. We have grown accustomed to attempts to silence us, to push us underwater completely. What we have worked for. We have rebuilt our nations again and again. We have fought and died for our homelands. But thanks to all of that, we are aware of what we have, we know what we have to lose, and we realize that Europe, which means all of us, is worth fighting for. We are certain that there are several ways to save the shared European project and the shared European classical values. Yes, because Europe is a shared cause, but not a global cause. For this reason, nobody should stay on the fence as we decide which way forward for our shared continent. Will we go in a direction that we choose together, or in a globalist direction imposed from above? Dear ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here today to discuss if our postmodern world has a place for classical values. My position, how I propose to start this debate, is yes. Moreover, I submit that there is a great need for classical values today. We need to stand firmly by normality. We need the triune rallying cry of God, homeland, family, which not only frames our lives, but offers an avenue of escape from the nihilistic, lazy-like culture professed by the Western political elites. I believe that we simply call the ideal of Christian freedom, what we simply call the ideal of Christian freedom, can be of great benefit to us in this struggle. Christian freedom does not see the individual as opposed to society in our understanding, or at least in my understanding. The genuine fulfillment of the individual is when he willingly subordinates himself to others, the family, the father, the mother, the grandparents, the children, the university campus, the nation, as a natural part of a greater community. And we must be reminded that we ourselves are Europe. To put it another way, what is left of Europe can be found only in Central Europe. There is an energy here that can still resist the non-Europe of today. because this region shares not just the experience of recently regained sovereignty, but also a historical past and common existential situations that arise from shared geography. And finally, allow me to quote one of the most significant and well-known persons in Hungarian politics, Count István Széchenyi, whom we often refer to as the greatest of Hungarians. He once said, "It all depends on us, but we must remain determined." If one of the greatest political thinkers of Hungarian history says so, I must believe him. I wish for all of us that as we protect our achievements and what we are creating now, we remain determined and show courage in the face of adversity. Together we stand, divided we fall. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miklos. Miklos essentially answered the question, is there a place for classical values in the postmodern world? The answer seems to be a simple yes, but we have a few other panelists with us who will answer that question more precisely. I'd like to first welcome my guests here, Professor Chantal Delsol, French philosopher and a novelist, Dr. Eugenia Eco from the Center for Media and Peace Initiatives, István Kovács, the Center for Fundamental Rights from Hungary, Professor Gladden Papin, Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Dallas, Professor Andrzej Zybertowicz, one of the advisors of President Andrzej Duda, and joining us from Washington online is Professor Marek Chodakiewicz from the Institute of World Politics. Miklos's introduction, I think, was very compelling and said a lot about the issues at hand. But what Miklos, I think, didn't approach is before we even answer the question of whether there is a place for classical values in the postmodern world, we should ask ourselves what these classical values are. And we must define the parameters of the debate to understand truly what it is these classical values are, what it is that we are fighting for, and what the definition of postmodernism and of a postmodern world is. Because the term postmodernism is incredibly broad and vague. It's understood in different ways by many different people. It's been popularized in recent years by Professor Jordan Peterson. But there is a lot of disagreement about what that is. And I'd like my panelists here, and I think we'll start with Professor Chantal Delsol. Could you give us an idea of what you think classical values are and what the parameters we are operating in? Are we actually living in a postmodern world?
Chers amis, merci de
Thank
votre
you,
accueil
dear friends, for your welcome.
et merci de me permettre de parler en français.
And thank you that I can speak French.
Alors, la question, ce sont les valeurs.
The questions are values.
La question, Chantal, c'est de définir quelles sont ces valeurs classiques.
So the question is how to define those values
Nous pouvons les conserver.
and can we conserve them?
Alors, je commencerai par dire que
I would like to start that the
n'ont
Catholics
pas vraiment
are not fully considered the major transformation that is taking place in our time. This is the end of a civilization from the 16th century.
Naturellement,
Of
je
course,
ne parle pas du christianisme.
I'm not talking about Christianity, which is alive and everywhere. I'm talking about Christendom as a civilization in which the laws and mores were inspired and dominated by Christianity.
L'énergie
The incredible energy with which Christian civilization
depuis 2 siècles
has struggled for 2 centuries not to die clearly shows that it has indeed formed a world, a cohesive world in all areas of life, and we call it Christendom. Christianity has built a civilization which has lived according to its laws and dogmas for 16 centuries.
La chrétienté comme civilisation,
Christianity as a civilization is the fruit of Catholicism,
religion communautaire,
a community religion,
défend une société
defending an organic society,
individualisme,
challenging individualism and individual freedom, Thus, the vocation of Christianity inclines it to be wary of modernity, which challenges its first principles. The first principles of Christianity are challenged: the truth, hierarchy, authority, and constraint. From the second half of the 20th century, libertarian or liberal postmodernity takes over Christianity and ousts over the Christianity as a civilization. From there on, Christianity no longer rules. Even though it exists in most of the countries where it ruled, it has become a minority religion. It is the end of a period of 16 centuries, about which I would like to talk. Thus, since the second half of the 20th century, our moral hierarchies have literally been reversed. I would give you a few examples. It is not uncommon concerning individual behavior and social acts that in a few years an evil has become a good and vice versa. That the old hated behavior is now praised. That the old admiration is changed in challenge. In the other word, look at the word of our fathers. 100 years ago, colonization was generous and admirable. Torture and war were worse go. Today, colonization and torture are satanic acts. And very largely the war too. Homosexuality was banned and despised, and today it is justified and praised. Abortion, previously criminalized, is being legitimized and advised. Pedophilia, previously seen as the stopgap that was supported to protect families and institutions, is now criminalized. Divorce, which was almost impossible and then difficult, no longer encounters any obstacle. Suicide was frowned upon. Remember, suicides were not offered a religious funeral. It is considered a possible benefit, and the laws in some countries help to achieve it. In a society, the table of mores is a focal point which concentrates the common philosophical choices. Permissible, vaunted, forbidden behavior is a sign of the thought of an era, for it is only the translation of something deeper, but a translation drenched in the blood and sweat of this precise society, and telling of its gods along with its conduct. Any signifying act reveals a belief, even a sleeping belief, if it is not conscious. If, for example, you make the sometimes cruel effort to remain with a difficult mate, your husband or wife, instead of separating from him, it is because you harbor a certain powerful idea of loyalty to oneself, in other words, of personal responsibility. Or another example, if you refuse to get rid of a superfluous and unwelcome embryo, it is that lies in your consciousness the certainty, poorly formulated perhaps, but real, that there is a dormant dignity here. In other words, all behavior engages beliefs. It's very important to know it and to say it out loud. The normative reversal that we have before us is even easier to understand. If we go back to the origins, the Christendom was established by first normative inversion. In the other direction, you may know that the Christianity starts in 394, the date of the Battle of the Cold River, the Frigidus,
la victoire de l'empereur
and the
Théodose.
victory of Theodosius.
C'est le premier,
The first, Theodosius, establishes the domination of Christian laws and laws,
une inversion
operating a normative inversion from the Roman morality of the time. In the space of a few decades, a moral reversal has taken place.
En peu d'années, par exemple,
In a few years, for example, divorce, homosexuality, infanticide were banned.
L'infanticide. Les chrétiens victorieux d'alors,
The victorious Christians are mostly represented among urban elites,
alors que les paysans
while
sont encore
peasants are still polytheists,
païens.
hence the pagan word from paganus, peasant.
À l'époque,
At that time, that happy time, the pagans then appear as conservatives, obsolete and outdated, and Christians call themselves modern. The word modernus in Latin appears at this time. We have some text to prove it. It is already a march towards progress. The winner appropriates the meaning of history. What we are experiencing today is a reversal in the other direction. The revolutionary period in the 18th century was what can be called the beginning of the end of Christendom. At this time, the Westerners begin to overthrow the common civilization. This process will last 2 centuries. It is made up of comings and goings, of struggles between detractors and defenders. It looks like the siege of a city. One could tell elsewhere the story of the succession of strikes, sometimes victorious and sometimes defeated. Just one example. Divorce in France. A law authorizing divorce was promulgated in 1792 during the Revolution. It was repealed in 1816 under the Restoration, but the divorce was re-established in July 1884. A law of the Vichy regime of April 2nd, 1941 restricted the possibilities. Finally, after the Second War, the laws on divorce made it easier and easier until mutual consent was reached. In other words, the drive to root out the principles of Christianity has met with failures and setbacks. It is that Christendom defends itself and mobilizes all its ardor to maintain the legislative and penal power of its mores. Yet, whatever happens, and despite some episodic successes, the tide has been rolling for 2 centuries in the same direction and never stops. The same goes for abortion laws, same-sex marriage, assisted reproduction, assisted suicide, etc. The old principles are going back step by step, sometimes fast and sometimes slowly, but with certainty. The normative reversal that we see at work here through this quiet and decisive evolution, which ends in the 20th century, represents almost the same exact of what happened in the 4th century. You remember the Plutarch's cry, "The great Pan is dead." It might have anticipated the end of paganism. You know who it is, the great Pan. The Priap, it's the god of sex and violence. The present time tells the story of the return to the great Pan. The circle is complete. Can I have some more? Yes. By comparing the 2 normative inversions 16 centuries apart, in one direction and in the other, we understand that the current emancipation of Moors responds to a consistency. It is simply the result of a radical transformation of beliefs. Why are we the new Moors, the ones I have just mentioned, taking hold so irresistibly and inevitably? Why does the modern stream seem invested with the future? Because the laws, customs, mores constantly seek to correspond to the beliefs of the moment. And today, Western man, you have to know it, Western man no longer believes in the principles of Christianity.
C'est un fait.
And it's a fact.
Et c'était ces principes qui fondaient
and this principle was founding our laws and mores. A normative inversion, especially of this magnitude, rests on the basis of a philosophical inversion. We do not upset the whole of morality in this way on a whim. We do it. We can't imagine people accepting divorce just because there are some caprices like that, whims like that. We do it because the foundations on which the old morality rested have been replaced by others. You know, each culture or civilization poses at an original and decisive moment in its history primordial ontological choices on which everything else is built and supported. Morals, the mores, laws, and customs. For Christendom, this decisive moment was the time for the first councils, the first, second, fourth truth, that established the outlines of the first truth of the 16th centuries of Christianity would live: God, the person, the moral. But there comes a day, and that it's now, when the faith in its first principle breaks down. This is what we are living now. As far as we are concerned, we are living at the breaking point where the primordial ontological choices concerning the meaning and place of man in the universe, the nature of the world, of the gods, are overturned. Thank you very much for explaining those transformations that happened to our Christian world. Now I would like, what Professor Chantal wanted to say is that this Western man does not believe anymore in those Christian values. I would like to give the floor.
If you could explain to us how you see this transformation that has occurred, if you agree with what Professor Del Sol has said, and what you see as the classical values that we are fighting for and that we are here to define.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be part of this history-making event, essentially because of several reasons. And if there is any value that I cherish, is truth. And at this moment, I like to make reference to Socrates when he said that an unexamined life is not worth living. So today, what we are doing here is an equivalence of examining our lives. What has gone wrong in terms of freedom and all that. And quite frankly, coming from the lens of a media practitioner and a college professor as well, I can tell you that both institutions of the media and even the university itself, both are threatened by the inability to really embrace what is called truth. To the point that some of us seem to believe that we are living in a post-truth world.
Could you specify what this truth is?
In a postmodern world, the definition of truth is really difficult to pin down. I do not want to go into a lot of philosophies, Immanuel Kant and all that. There are different perceptions, different views about what truth really means. However, why I want to really emphasize the understanding of truth from the perspective of media is the fact that all the debates going on, especially within the US that I'm more familiar with, you recognize that sometimes there is an attempt by other politicians or media practitioners themselves to twist facts. And like the famous senator from New York used to say, you know, people forget that you are not entitled to, you're only entitled to your opinion, not to the facts. Because facts are sacred. So, but today, there is almost a kind of corruption of the system whereby even some people talk about alternative facts. Facts is fact. There is nothing like any alternative. It's either it's truth or it is not. And I'm also worried by the fact that because what I wanted to talk about actually is how somehow we celebrated things like the social media as breaking barriers of information flow, but there seems to be a paradox in terms of how such things have also exacerbated falsehood in many ways. Like I tell my students, sometimes you can stay here and publish whatever you want to publish on Facebook and Twitter, right? I say we have so many publishers, but we have very few editors. Because typically, in a certain newsroom, why you find people on the desk is that there's an attempt to kind of filter information to make sure it is accurate. But today, anyone can publish from his or her room, and nobody verifies the information. And worse still is that even the media organizations themselves pick information from some of these opinionated information found on social media with less verification mechanisms. So, and it threatens the flow of information in the sense that, yeah, it's true there's freedom for us to express ourselves, because I'm one of the persons who believe in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that talks about freedom of expression and freedom to hold opinions, and regardless of frontiers. That is key. But at the same time, just like some previous speakers said, some of the issues in terms of, there's no absolute freedom, and it comes with responsibility and obligations. And to that extent, it behoves on all of us, and like some other people have also said in terms of how the university is a citadel where we pursue the truth through research, we embrace publicly, and we engage the public in this conversation, and today, it may not be there because there's crisis in the education system. I'll give you one instance. Just recently, a Pulitzer-winning Nicole Hannah Jones, who has this 1619 project, was denied tenure at the North Carolina University simply because of the 1619 project she probably did. Nobody really can say for sure, but obviously, there are indications that it may have some, connection to that. So that's really diminishing academic freedom or freedom of expression. People should be allowed to express themselves. Okay, look at what happened with George Floyd incidents. Look at the report of the police. If not for this 17-year-old girl who sent this information on Facebook, nobody would have known the truth. The police just said it was an incident, and no reference was made whatsoever about what actually happened, that someone was kneeling on a human being and the person died. So to that extent, we see how useful social media can be. And I think in the cause of truth or pursuit of truth, all of us should be effective netizens. What I mean by netizenship is the fact that all of us now are inhabitants of the internet. Like Eric Schmidt will say, it's kind of an estate, connected estate, which all of us live. And in living there, we must play our roles in different ways. To the extent to which we can complain from now to tomorrow, and somehow we don't play our part in either holding people accountable by verification of information and by reducing the preponderance of falsehood and spreading of falsehood in the social media. Because social media can be a force for good, but at the same time, it can also be, has its own challenges. So I'm conscious of the time. I actually prepared some remarks and some slides. If necessary, I can develop it and still send it to you for your records. But interestingly, I'm really happy with what you guys are doing here in terms of, and I think it should be a model for other countries and other organizations as well, to see how we can, as a humanity, save the world today, because obviously everybody admits that there are so many challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I think some key words there that fell with the words duty, responsibility, accountability. István, I know about the work that you do in Hungary, and Hungary has been held up as one of the models in terms of how to transform academia. The reforms that Orbán has recently introduced have been very controversial. But I'd like to, if you could explain, István, how you see the issue and how you are seeing the transformation of education in Hungary and attempting to restore it and bring it back to classical values, because I think that's been happening in Hungary.
Let me step back just one, because the original question was, what are the classical values? And I promise I will answer your question about Hungarian education system, even though I'm not an expert of it. But in order to define what the classical values are, I think we should define identity. Because many say that identity consists of values, so it's a bunch of values. In my views, identity is like a stair of three different steps build each other. And on the first step, the first level of identity is like the relationship between the individual and the transcendent. On the second level, which is built on the first one, is the relationship between the individual and its smallest circle of individual, the family. And the third step, which is built on the first and the second one, is the relationship between the individual and their tightest circles. The tightest one is like a nation state in Europe. And I think that this is true from the dawn of times, that each and every individual ever lived can or could identify him or herself in these three steps. So if you accept this, the European identity is like, of course, the first step is Christianity, the relationship between the individual and the Holy Trinity. Of course, the second step is the relationship between the individual and his family, so the Christian family, a woman, a man, and their children. And, you know, marriage is not just a contract, but it's a sacrament. And the third step is the nation state, like we like to emphasize here in Europe from the conservative side. And all the values which we identify like classical values are around these three steps. And the problem with like modern values, and why I think that our values, classical values, be them, I would prefer like Christian values, are superior because they can be driven back to the truth. And to me, the truth is God, because he himself declared that, you know, I am the truth. And all of the values which I would identify like classical values can be driven back to God. And the problem with modern values is that they cannot drive back their values to anywhere. So they were created by the mankind. And the problem is that, as I mentioned, the hierarchy of values, which is the hierarchy of identity, these three steps, and the first step is God. And if you put God away, you will never understand the Christian family model, for example, as a value. We regard it as a value, one of the most important ones as a classical value, but you will never understand if you don't know who God is, or you have no clue about Christianity. So this is why, in another part of the world, classical values may mean something else. So in the Muslim world, the Christian marriage and the Christian family model, they will never understand why we handle it as a valuable, even a sacrament. But here in Europe, what happened? They first take away the first step, God. And then, like, our values around family suddenly lost their basis. So if there's no God and there's no creation, like it cannot be true that God created men to be men and women, a female or male, then everyone can decide whether he wants to be like, something else. And back to, sorry, I promised I will answer your question about education. What happened in Hungary started, and your question was about university, and I totally understand why, because...
But István, maybe we'll go back to the university, because I'd like Gladden to confront this idea. Professor, if you could, the thesis here is that classical values are essentially intrinsically linked to God, and in that case, faith. And postmodernism, conversely, is linked to lack of faith. Is that something, whilst we're defining the parameters of the debate, would you agree with István that faith and God are essential to classical values and that we cannot have classical values without God?
Certainly so. As we think about the character of the modern and the postmodern world, I think a helpful way of illuminating this point that we've been discussing, and maybe a concept which has become both an important part of the modern world and also a weakness of it may be important. And that's the concept of innovation. If there's anything that the modern and the postmodern world is supposed to be known for, it's that concept. The notion that dramatic change is possible and that the most impressive accomplishments, the greatest features of the modern world and now the postmodern world come from this. Obviously, if we think about innovation in the modern world, we think about the greatest changes that built modern society, the invention of electricity, modern agricultural techniques, engineering, and things like that. In the postmodern world, innovation has become something more fluid, something more commonplace. Everyone is supposed to seek to be innovative. And where I think we're going, and this part connects back to your question, we've begun to approach a point at which this great value of postmodern civilization is becoming empty. Everywhere there's talk of innovation, everywhere there's talk of dramatic change, but in fact, the most impressive innovations that built the modern world are already there. We already have electricity, we already have computer technology, and now this concept has become empty. It's become something that is cheap. It's become overused, and it's become harder to, I think, genuinely find this true quality of innovation. So 2 comments on where classical values and the value, and specifically the value of faith that you mentioned might be useful here. First of all, with regard to a proper framework that we could use to think about innovation so as to have it be a crucial part of our societies as it is, but one which is constructive. In the ancient world, when Aristotle and Plato thought about innovation, they viewed it as something that tended to weaken or destroy societies. In other words, if you aim at innovation, if you assume that the most important human task is not preserving the past or preserving things that are good, but just inviting in reckless innovation, you're very likely to lose something that's valuable. The true task, according to the ancients, the task that required the greatest displays of human virtue was actually the task of preservation. It's not easy to hand on the things that are important. It requires continually trying to understand them, and maybe even looking around in our world and seeing that it has become an inhospitable place for preserving them. The task of preserving the things that are valuable for the ancients is in fact the one that would draw forth the greatest efforts of human accomplishment and civilization. When the ancients, and particularly the first Christians, thought about the act of faith, they thought about it in terms of conversion. Conversion for them, and particularly in the early Christian literature, was the place where the quality of genuine newness and innovation, if you will, was to be found. The early Christian writers spoke of, in the scriptures, of putting off the old man and putting on the new. Newness was supposed to be a feature of that experience, leaving behind the things of sin, leaving behind the things of the world, and turning toward God, and in that process, finding a new type of human experience that was touched by the divine and opened up into a separate world. Today, in other words, I think in the postmodern world, we've lost this true sense of innovation in those two respects. It's not simply that we have to go back and just remember classical values as though they're irrelevant. This marquee value of modern civilization has become a kind of spent force. And if we still want to have a technological civilization, which we do, if we still want to have a civilization which is aiming toward good innovations, then we need to start thinking about making our goal preserving the things that are good, enabling a space for having this experience of newness and faith. And with that, I think we could have a kind of leverage over this marquee value of modern civilization. Modernity says it has innovation, and the classical ways are merely old, crusty, dead, dying. That's not the way that the classics thought about the task of preserving civilization. That's not the way they thought about the task, not the task, but the experience of faith. They thought of both of those as being a site of change and an experience of newness. And so as we give witness to that in projects like this, in all the new classical education experiments in the United States, which have been coming on in recent years, I think we'll see that true innovation and an experience of it is actually a part of preserving classical values.
Thank you, Glenn. Panie profesorze, głos polski. Tutaj profesor Del Sol mówił na temat transformacji od tych.
Professor Del Sol was talking about the transformation of classical values in the postmodern world, given an example of France.
Momencie, w którym się znaleźliśmy, mianowicie takim, że została
what is the point that we are now, the void,
z powodu tego postmodernizmu.
Because of this postmodernism.
Czyli z naszej, gdzie
From our perspective, when the West treats us as traditional conservative society, in what point Poland is there any place in Poland for traditional values? Are we really in a postmodern country? And coming back to the same beginning of this debate, what are your, Mr. Professor, the definitions of the classical values and this postmodern world? Ladies and gentlemen, I would not refer to the first question, the first part of your question, because you did not send us those the topic of the discussion, and that we should speak about the values of the classical values in the context of modern world. But first, I would like to start about the fear that I feel during all those speeches that we have today. All my heart, I am pro this founding of an institution that would take care of academic freedom and would try to save some classical values. But today, what I have heard many declarations related to ideology and religion more than scientific analysis. If it's the perspective of Collegium Intermarium, then I think you would fail. It would be like a next part according to the benedictile option, because the truth wins not without any weapon. In today's world, those who are against the classical truth have a lot of weapons. They are numerous, and from this point of view, it's good that the first major faculty of this university is the law, because if we have the law to fight and we use its tools, it's a very advanced, subtle, and without being professional in an academic way, it's not possible to face, to get against, but it's not enough. When I'm thinking about what I could tell you, I would like to give a message, to advise you in a way, and to give you my hope. I would like to advert you that the hard sociological analysis of our technological technosphere that we have nowadays. It is highly disrupted. We cut our culture, the continuity that we have in transmission of culture that we have observed for thousands of years. Now we have a great rupture of this transmission that happened in the family, in the neighboring surrounding, at school, in regional institutions and in academia. The young generation is taken by the way of technology and taken out of the tradition. And it can turn out that it does not matter that if a nation has 300 years of tradition, 200, because the pressure of this infosphere, which is in its structure so poisonous, that this immersion will neutralize the force of the tradition. And if Zuzanna Zuboff, a retired professor of Harvard University, who has also published a book in Polish, The Capitalism and Invigilation, we live in a world in which we see a putsch. Cybermen observe, thanks to great databases, how people think in many places and all over the world. The liberal democracy has led to uncommon accumulation of power and knowledge of very few people. This power, knowledge has been accumulated in a few hands. We would not save the values, the classical values. I would like to discuss one of them closely in a minute. If we do not get to the Cybermen and break this mirror from which they can observe us. And now I'd like to talk about this hope that we are looking for. I have read, I was very shocked, the lecture of Chantal Dessau, and those elements the professor has presented today, and I thought, the cultural processes that influence us when we see the shock of some different values, when we see Christendom being confronted to laik knowledge, to science that still works in the scientifical looking for science, has really been damaged and ruined. because of the Copernican revolution, Darwinism, and today it's under pressure or neuroscience and perspective for transhumanism. But it can still survive. While we look at this what we call gender revolution, I think that if we could, thanks to such initiatives like Collegium Intermarium, reveal this strength of academic freedom and research, so that we could analyze openly those LGBT environments, to analyze them according to the methodology of scientific research, on adoption of single-sex parents. And if we see the results of this education of gender, LGBT, transgender, then this trend of revolution, the liberal gender revolution, would not survive this shock with this science. Christianity has survived. It is weak. It is in a crisis because it's a very hard crisis. It's a shock with culture and science, but the shock with the truth, the conflict with the truth, this is the good news, and this is the hope I have. But if here in this collegium, if in your collegium you just quote the ideological declarations instead of brightening and sharpening the analytical mind, we would not win this fight. Because the value of those classical issues is the love of which is symbolized by the icon of Virgin Mary with her son. You can be religionally indifferent, you can be a non-believer, but we should really doubt his humanity if this person cannot see the message of humanity. This is a classical icon. It is a sign of love, of intimacy and investment that people have in their own lives. The mother love, the grandmother love. The cipher civilization, how it was noticed in the book of Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray he's gay, a declared one. He says about the craziness of the ideology, because on the basis of not checked, not proven statements, it starts to rebuild the public institutions, and it's crazy. So the aim of Collegium Intermarium is the professional fight of this craziness and not just ideology. If this mission succeeds, then we would save the message of love. This is the end of my statements. Remember, we can't survive the coming up from our failures, because later there would be some sins reminded and this person would be cancelled. There is no caritas if we have charity, if we don't forget our previous sins. So we have to we have to fight against this Venetian mirror that the Cybermen are looking at us from, because this is just a social hypothesis. In this shock of culture, we would not save the sign of the Mother Mary with her son.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I teraz przechodzimy do Stanów Zjednoczonych.
And now we are moving to the United States.
Panie profesorze, czy pan profesor Zybertowicz między innymi mówił o szaleństwie, odwołując się do książki Douglasa Murraya. I tutaj, czy rzeczywiście doszliśmy, szczególnie
this craze, this madness, speaking of Douglas Murray's book, is this what has been achieved already in the United States society or not yet?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to make a disclaimer. My opinions are my own and not the Institute of World Politics, which is my employer. And as far as everything else, I'm glad most people don't have COVID haircuts. So that makes me happy. It means Poland's moving along. I get my hair cut by my wife. So there we go, as far as organization. Now, a few points. America's far gone. You have every right to be smug about the Intermarium. And it is mostly because of faith. But I agree with Professor Zybertowicz to the extent that ratio is important. He forgot about faith. He's scared of faith. Not everybody has a gift of faith, but bless him. As he knows, I love him. Ratio et fides is what we need to face current times, or at any time. As far as other American issues that I'd like to mention, one of the panelists talked about the 1619 project and the denial of tenure. Well, number one, 1619 project is bunk. It is a postmodernist exercise in mendacity. The university has every right to exercise quality control. This time, shockingly, the university partly exercised quality control as far as the purveyor of mendacity is concerned, and she was denied tenure. That's true. However, what you need to know is she received a contract for 5 years, a very handsome contract. So when things go away, she will get tenure or she'll get contract renewal. She's just fine. She's not a victim. A 5-year contract. That we are even discussing a racist screed that insinuates that somehow, because I'm white, I am responsible for slavery. Well, that's the face of postmodernity too. So I have something else for you. I'd like you to reflect on a little poem. I am going to feed into the stereotype purveyed by Bismarck that the Poles are the best poets among politicians and the best politicians among poets. Why the classics? In the 4th book of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides narrates a story of his failed expedition. Amidst long speeches by leaders, battles, sieges, the plague, a thick spider web of intrigue and diplomatic maneuvers, this episode is as a needle in the forest. The Athenian colony of Amphipolis fell to Brasidias because Thucydides was late to the rescue. He paid for it to the city of his birth with life in exile. Exiles of all times understand the price. The generals of last wars, when faced with similar affairs, moan on their knees before their progeny, praising their own heroism and innocence. They blame their underlings, jealous peers, adversarial winds. Thucydides says only that he had 7 ships, it was winter, and he sailed fast. Should the topic of a play be a shattered pitcher, a petty shattered soul wallowing in pity over itself, that which shall remain after us will be as a lamentation of lovers in a small dirty hotel when the wallpaper dawns. Thus Zbigniew Herbert, in his famous poem, he juxtaposes the classics and modernity, post-modernity. This, of course, is a scathing indictment of postmodernity. At the same time, it's a pan to the classical, for it is universal. It is also the answer to our panel's title, The Place of Classical Values in Postmodernist World. Well, they are everywhere. Naturally, the place does not change. It remains central because of the very universality of our classical inheritance. No matter what the circumstances, the Gulag, Auschwitz, or the currently dominant liberal dictatorship of pleasure, aka postmodernism, the values endure just as natural law does. Now, it is an entirely different matter how we resolve to handle the challenge of cherishing, preserving, and propagating classical values in the postmodern world. Naturally, we can set up an elaborate strategy and argue for a cookie-cutter approach. Good luck, given that most of us who cherish tradition are not the Prussian army. We are individualists. Look at our panel. Everybody has an opinion, and that's the way it should be. We can also give a general call to a reconquista, an all-out, multi-dimensional effort or a gradual, premeditated one. I am still awaiting a feasible proposition. It is easy then to be smug about the remnant in the Intermarium. It is another thing to handle what's being heaped up on us. Thus, what I am left with is my own individual way to tackle the movement. What I do, personally, is I ignore the postmodernist powers that be. I ignore the terror of political correctness. I ignore the expectations of the literati. I stay true to the classics. I teach them in my lectures and seminars. It's as if no outside world existed. In my benevolent royal dictatorship of my mind, my students are free to enjoy them or reject them. I teach the kids not what to think, but how to think. I combine ratio et fides. To do so, I introduce the classics. I refer to them frequently. Mostly, I draw blank stares at the beginning because perhaps most of our students have not heard of Thucydides or Homer. Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome for them tend to be like Atlantis. But fear not, they eventually become engaged and conversant in the classics, given time with me. As Zbigniew Herbert has taught us, no barbarians in the garden of the classics are allowed. Should he step in, it is our duty to convert him. And do not be discouraged. It has to be one soul at a time. Thank you very much.